So veal blanquette refers to a braise that is cooked low enough for you to prevent any caramelization on your meat, and this is typically served with buttered noodles. You can serve it with rice pilaf. You can serve it in what we're making today, which is known as a vol au vent. Vol au vent is nothing more than puff pastry. It's the vehicle in which you're going to serve this, and so it's a very classic, very vol au vent there in the chat box. Vol au vent it's a nice presentation when you have this really beautiful dark crust. And again, I might have mentioned that this almost tastes like a pot pie. It's essentially what we're creating is a velouté, a veal stock-based velouté that is going to be the cooking liquid in which this veal, which is top round that we're using, is going to cook in. We finish with cream, and then you finish with some peas, but really simple, sort of rustic, but very classic. So anytime if you ever need to cook something blanquette, whether it's lamb, veal, or beef, it's the technique that's being used. And what I have is a pound of veal that has been cubed, and it has already been cut to about an inch size cube. I leave some fat on there because this is going to cook for 45 minutes on the stove, upwards of an hour, or until the veal becomes really nice and tender. So because we're using a tough cut of meat, we want to make sure that we can cook it long enough. This is going to have some flour, which thickens the cooking liquid that it's served with. And so you just want to make sure that you don't get any color, or as little as possible. So what I have is some veal that's been cut into large cubes, seasoned with salt and pepper. Okay. We have some beef stock, lemon that is used to finish, 8 ounces of heavy cream that is also served at the very end, incorporated, chopped parsley, frozen peas or fresh peas if they're in season. Okay, don't hate on frozen peas because they're picked at their freshness. They're picked at their peak, and then they are individually quick frozen or flash frozen, so you actually maintain the freshness of when they're picked. So bear with the video quality, the color shifted. But in any case, what you want to do is also get some mirepoix. And I have mirepoix, 1 whole onion, 2 carrots, some celery, and some garlic that has been cut medium dice. And this is a super classic dish where you're going to actually serve all of the ingredients that are in the braise. Coat your veal with a little bit of flour. This again is going to help thicken the cooking liquid. And as usual, you want to start with what's going to take the longest first. So we have our veal that we can start. In a braising pan, I have some melted butter that we're going to add. And we also have mushrooms that have been cut. These are white button mushrooms that have been quartered. Okay, so you can use oil if you want to. You can use clarified butter if you still have some clarified butter. But ultimately, we just want a little bit of fat in our pan so that we can start to cook our veal, we get a little bit of color as that flour is beginning to toast, but you don't want to cook this under incredibly high heat. Okay, now shift gears. So in your braising pan, add your veal. Again, I leave some fat on there just because once this gets really nice and tender, you do have a little bit more flavor if you leave some of that fat. So veal goes in. You just really want to coat those cubes of veal in the fat. I use butter because once we add our stock, it's going to emulsify into that braising liquid rather than using oil, which would ultimately come up to the surface and is something that you'd need to skim because your braising liquid is going to be greasy if you don't. So whole butter or clarified butter, either way, they'll emulsify a lot nicer than just using oil. We're going to use aromatics in the form of fresh thyme, sprig of rosemary, whole garlic. Now, the garlic, you can take the whole head of garlic and cut it right down the middle and add it to your aromatic. And optional is some white wine. If you want to use some white wine, you're going to deglaze with that white wine. Get some of that flour that may be sticking to the bottom. And then add your mirepoix, your garlic, which is sliced in this case, but again, you can add it whole. And then you want to sweat that mirepoix. Now I want to turn down the heat. Sweat that mirepoix before you add your beef stock. Now your beef stock, you can use water. You can use chicken stock because this is ultimately a light dish. It should be relatively light in color once you're done. And that comes from the cream that we'll add at the end. So if you're using beef stock, it is going to add a little bit more color to it. But you can use water. You can use chicken stock if you want. But when you're ready to put your stock in, you want to have enough stock in there to come up to the surface of that meat. And maybe just a little bit more. So maybe a 1/4 inch of liquid above the meat. And this is going to cook for an hour or until your veal is tender. Keep your heat on low because there is flour. This is going to reduce as that liquid is simmering, and it can potentially stick on the bottom and then burn. So periodically you want to go in there and you want to check it. Now, by the time that your liquid has reduced, most of the time, that's going to take me around 40 minutes for that to really reduce. And you're going to get something by that point that is starting to become tender. It should start to be tender by that point. If you find that your veal is tender and you still have too much liquid, then you can turn up the heat and then just reduce it until it thickens up. Lemon, we're going to finish with, so we're not going to add the lemon until the very end. And then the heavy cream is also something that we're going to add at the end. Otherwise, you run the risk of curdling your cream, and then you add the lemon along with that cream. It'll also, you also risk curdling that cream. So anytime you're having cream in your dish, you want to do that as a finishing step. So this cooks for 45 minutes or until it reduces, and or your veal becomes nice and tender. So for the vol au vent, we're using puff pastry. Switching gears again.
Chef?
Yes.
So we are doing it on the burner rather than putting it in the oven, correct?
Correct, yes. And I typically don't cover it. Although, I mean, if you have some foil and you're going to do it on the stove, just keep the temperature controlled. You can cover it if you'd like, but I find that as long as there's enough liquid in there, then it's usually not a problem. Now, at some point, if your veal isn't tender yet and it's been cooking for an hour, then you might have to add more liquid. So if it's not tender yet and you start to see that liquid reduce too far, add a little bit more hot liquid, stock or water, and then allow it to continue to cook. Okay, so for the vol au vent, we have puff pastry. The puff pastry today, when you get it, we're going to have it as frozen as possible, as frozen as humanly possible. And I've done is cut 2 squares of the puff pastry, 5 by 5 inches. And make sure that that's as even as you possibly can get it. And now, in a sheet tray, or on a sheet tray with parchment paper, put 1 sheet or 1 square of your puff pastry down, and egg wash it. And what I have is an egg wash with 1 whole egg. You can use just egg yolk if you wanted to. I have 1 whole egg that's been beaten with some water, okay? If you didn't have egg and you wanted to use cream, then you can brush some cream on the puff pastry as well. But what you want to do is first, on the bottom sheet, you want to get a good coating of your egg wash. And this is going to act as a glue for the next sheet. The next sheet, if you have an oval ring ring mold. If you don't, you can cut this with a knife. An oval ring mold would look really nice. What I'm using is the largest ring mold that I have. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut that straight through. And this one I'm going to place right on top of the other sheet, like so. And then we egg wash that top. So press it down really nice, and then egg wash the top. And I have an oven preset at 400 degrees. Preset at 400 degrees. And your top, if you can add your top to it, it's always nice. Let's see how much room we have first. Egg wash the bottom, cut a ring through the second sheet, put that on top, and egg wash the top. And then you want to use a rack, if possible. You want to put that rack down right on top. So when this rises, if I didn't put the rack, then this is going to rise and it can, go sideways, or it can do any number of things. So generally, it's a good idea to put something to create a ceiling, so that when this bakes, it stops at some point. It'll puff up, it'll get really nice golden brown, and then it'll sort of stay there. Now, the middle part of that sheet is going to obviously rise to the top as well. We'll then cut that down, punch it down, and this is going to be the base. This is going to be the vehicle. When I say vehicle, I mean, where it's going to be served. So instead of a plate, instead of putting the blanquette on the plate, you would put it in your puff pastry or vol au vent, and that gets served on the plate. So move this over. The top is a good garnish. If you wanted to use that as a topper, you can do that. So now this goes into the oven, 400 degrees for 15 minutes, or until it's done, as we say. How long do you cook it? Cook it till it's done. Everybody's oven is going to be different. So you do want to have a temperature on that that's really high, so that it, because puff pastry has so much butter in it, you do want to make sure that that cooks very fast. And so if you have it at a really high temperature, the idea is that it'll begin to puff up immediately. And once it does puff up, it should stay puffed up. If your temperature is too low, then what can potentially happen is that you're going to have butter that's going to seep out, and then it's going to start to get flat, sort of deflate. So once it's finished, it should look something like this, okay? And then you have the cutout that you can use on the side. You can serve that with it. Now, if this puffs up, you push that down, and then this is where you're going to serve your actual braid. So we have our vol au vent done. We have one done already. Once your puff pastry comes out, you do want to let it rest. So let that rest, and then let that cool so that it finishes, so it gets dry. Otherwise, it'll be somewhat soggy. You want it to be as crispy as possible. You want that texture to contrast the softness of the veal. Okay, so now for our veal, we have some top round. And the top round again is a tough cut. So Notice the color on that. It is sort of like a dark pink. So this is 8 pounds. 8 pounds of veal leg. Pretty good size. Pretty decent size leg. But just like the beef leg, you're gonna have a lot of fat on the outside. If you wanted to do this in a roast and you wanted to slow cook the whole thing, you do have exterior fat that you want to remove. Okay, this would be good for sausages if you want to incorporate that with some of the ground veal. But for us to eat it like that, it's not something that we want. You do have some connective tissue again on the outside, and there's a few ways that you can attack this. And really, what we want to do is sort of expose the muscles, okay, and begin to take off some of that exterior fat, and then we'll see the grain on this muscle. So there's 2 pounds of chopped veal, cubed up veal that everybody's gonna get, and then there's 1.5 pounds of large chunks of veal that everybody's gonna get for your scallopini. Again, take a look at that video with the piccata if you haven't already, and you're gonna have a large 1.5 pounds of veal that's going to be just completely cubed up for you to decide how much fat you want to leave on there, how big you want your scallopini. And so you're going to have to determine the silver skin, what's the good fat that you want to leave on, and what needs to be removed. So if you remember from garde manger, when you're taking apart the round, you just want to follow the seams, and then that'll direct you and help you separate those muscles. So what you're seeing right in the middle here, what I'm kind of trimming around, is what's known as the eye of round. We talked about that. So this is something that you can use for roasting, or it's something that you can use for steaks if you wanted to get steak. And it's identified by this long sort of gooseneck shape to it. On the cow, it would be known as the gooseneck. Now, some of this exterior with the fatty pieces on, we are going to cube up so that the diced veal that you guys get does have some fat, again, because it just makes it a nicer end product, so that it's not dry. Even though you're braising it, it can potentially dry out. So it's a good idea to leave some, or you can completely take it off. That is one of the things that people also like, is that veal tends to be a lot leaner. So check it on the puff pastry. Don't forget that. Puff pastry, again, it's going to go for 15 minutes or until it's done. So you're going to get a good amount of golden brown on that. And then you want to go ahead and take that out. So this eye muscle that we're taking off here is going to be one that, if you get that at the store, you can truss it and then just make a roast. On the cow, on a larger cow, This would be the cut that you would see marketed as London broil. Sort of roll that out. What you see on the opposite end of this eye of round that I'm peeling away over here is the knuckle. So far, this is where we're at. This sort of elongated shaped muscle is the eye of round. Also on the cow known as the gooseneck, okay? And then this piece here that's sort of football or heart shaped is the knuckle. So once you get underneath those seams, you can begin to pull it away. And then it just sort of rolls. So if this were bone, I'd be scraping against the bone. Right here, I'm just trying to peel away and cut in between those seams. And the knuckle is also good for roasting because it's got this sort of irregular, but this irregular shape that you can ultimately stuff if you wanted to on this end. This has to have the fat removed further. But if you wanted to, once you take the fat off, you can roast this whole, okay? You can marinate that. And now, there's also another, there's a German dish known as Sauerbraten. And top round, eye of round is many times used in that preparation. And Sauerbraten means sour meat. It's a classic dish where you're going to see the meat cut into large chunks. And then it's marinated overnight with mirepoix, wine, red wine, sometimes red wine vinegar. And then it's braised, and at the very end, it's garnished and finished with ginger snap cookies on the very top of it. So that's something that you're going to see also help tenderize. So if we were to marinate this in some red wine, some vinegar overnight, that would also tenderize it. Then that dish is classically braised, further making the meat nice and tender. But so this is, again, the gooseneck on the cow or the eye of round, okay? And now this makes a really good roast if you trust this, but you can also get some steaks out of it, okay? And it's identified by this long sort of shape. But once we're here, now that we're here, you're going to be able to see the fine grain or large grain of muscle fibers running down that, okay? Again, it's a relatively inexpensive cut. You can get steaks from here only because you can get really nice medallions out of it, and I'll show you a few of those. But ultimately, it's not the most tender. So marinating for this works really, really well. But in any case, you can see really fine grain running down that. Okay. Now, if you wanted to cut steaks out of this, take off the silver skin. That gets discarded. And then your steaks from here, I'm going to cut just a large chunk because that way there's more for you guys to use if you wanted to make your scallopini. So you're going to get a large chunk. From here, you can see that can be trussed. You have a good size medallion that you can use as a steak if you wanted to, right? Or you can cut these as thin as you want. This is also something good. So if you want to make steaks, right? eye of round steak, you can get your steaks from there. So when you get the large chunk of veal that you're going to use for scallopini, I recommend cutting it about a 1/4 inch, okay, or 1/2 inch in thickness. And then this is going to be pounded out. So you'll get at least 4 portions of scallopini. Cut the chunks of meat that you get into more manageable slices. And then this, you then wrap in plastic wrap, pound that out, okay? And you can ultimately get something that, again, you tenderize, but, you know, physically, okay? Salisbury steak, if you've ever, you know, seen Salisbury steak in the, you know, frozen food section. Another classic dish, what's known as a Swiss steak. We have a machine that you put this through the machine, and it has these rollers that come in there with a bunch of needles and sort of tenderize that. So the finished product looks like a hamburger patty, and it's just got a bunch of needles in there, a bunch of sort of cuts that the machine makes that also helps tenderize it, also widens that. So if you wanted to make, you know, milanesa or country fried steak, you can use this, right? So this is the cut that you'd want to use. Okay, so I have round, the knuckle, and then the cap, the beef cap that's on the surface of that. Is something that you would use for grinding because it has a good amount of fat, but it's not very tender. Okay, so any questions so far? Comments? Critiques? Okay. So moving back to our vol au vent. And our blanquette. Check our vol au vent. It does get a lot of color because of that, the amount of fat that's in that puff pastry, and because of the egg wash. So be careful with that. This was 400 degrees at for 15 minutes. Really, really good amount of color. Maybe a little bit too dark. So again, this oven runs really, really hot. Mine at home does not. So it all depends. It really does. Okay, so shifting gears just a little bit more, we'll go ahead and get our base. Our vol au vent. Ready? Okay, push the inside of that dough in so that you have a little bed, a little nest for that veal to sit in. And then we'll go ahead and finish it. Okay, so shifting gears one more time, two more times. Okay, so this one needs to cook for another hour. We have one that's already been cooking for an hour. And you see that this one that's been cooking for a little bit longer is starting to really thicken up. And ultimately, again, what you is a velouté, okay? It's a really nice veal reduction, and that becomes sort of like the gravy. This has already been seasoned with salt and pepper, but now is a good time to taste it, okay? And now you definitely want to make sure that the consistency is where you want it, okay? And so it should be nice and thickened, nappe. It shouldn't be watery. And if your veal is tender, when you add your cream, it is going to thin it out. So the final dish you want to be thick enough so that when you add the heavy cream into it, it doesn't thin it out too much. Frozen peas. Go in at the very end. Chopped parsley. If you had, if you go to the farmer's market and you get baby carrots, rainbow carrots, you can use the carrots and keep them whole so that it just gives you a little bit, you know, more elegant presentation if you leave those carrots, maybe cut them right in half. And then for our cream, if you remember using cream when making sauces, you can't just add that cream directly to something that's already hot. It's really hot. So what you need to do is temper that. Okay? And again, what that means is taking the cold cream, taking some of the hot cooking liquid, incorporating that hot liquid into that cold cream. So that the cream becomes about the same temperature as the liquid that you're about to incorporate it into. Again, this is a finishing step. So you want to make sure that you do this at the very end. This will lighten up the dish. And the longer that this sits, because the veal was coated in flour, it will continue to thicken up. So if you leave this on the stove, when you come back, you are going to have a skin on the surface of it, and it'll thicken up. Again, you can make this ahead of time, and then when you're ready to serve it, you just have to rehydrate it with a little bit more liquid. Okay, but that's ultimately a somewhat of a matter of preference. I prefer to have a little bit of liquid just to sort of soak up all the flavor that's been created by cooking it for so long. And then at the very, very end, you know, ultimately some lemon, you can serve it. You can serve it on the side if you wanted to. But as soon as you add your lemon, you want to take it off the heat, turn off the heat, and then all we have to do is plate. If you wanted to, if you didn't want to serve it in the vol au vent, last time. If you didn't want to serve it in the vol au vent, then what you can do is cook your puff pastry separately. And then use that as a garnish or serve it on the side. Okay. Top on there. Pretty dated dish, but the cooking technique is what's really important. Again, it's one of those things that you should know how to make. Somebody asks you to make blanquette. It is very classical, so I think it is important to demonstrate. But there you go, veal blanquette with puff pastry vol au vent. And then, you know, again, you can add more cream if you wanted to and less cooking liquid if you wanted to. but it's really like a pot pie